There have been very few deaths in the annals of English royal history that have brought up as much controversy, horror, and interest as the death of King Edward II in the year 1327. The events that took place on that September night within the stone walls of Berkeley Castle continue to be one of the most terrifying mysteries that have ever been uncovered in medieval England. There are official documents that speak of natural causes, but there are also whispered reports that tell of something much more sinister. A death that was so horrific and symbolic that it was planned not simply to terminate a life, but to send a message that would resonate through the years until it was finally put to rest. Edward Plantagenet was born to inherit one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. Yet he passed away as a prisoner in his own kingdom, abandoned by his nobility, betrayed by his wife, and reviled by a significant number of his subjects. His reign, which was defined by military catastrophes and personal scandals, culminated in a downfall that was so complete that even his way of death became a weapon that his adversaries used against him. The narrative that you are about to hear will contradict all that you believed you understood about the court system of the Middle Ages, the power of the royal family, and the extent that people will go to in order to obliterate a legacy that they revile. It is not a coincidence that the methods that were supposedly employed to take Edward's life were selected at random. Rather, they were deliberate, symbolic, and intended to reflect what his adversaries considered to be his biggest failures. However, in order to differentiate between historical reality and political propaganda in this particular instance, we will need to wade through multiple layers of hearsay, chronicler stories, and intentional deception that have disguised the truth for almost 7 centuries. What emerges is a story that exposes as much about the views of medieval people toward power, sexuality, and retribution as it does about the tragic end of one monarch. This is not just a story about how a king passed away. It is also a story about how power can corrupt, how human ties can bring down kingdoms, and how the desire of retribution may lead to acts of brutality that are beyond comprehension. As we go deeper into the final chapter of Edward II's life, we will investigate not just what may have occurred in that castle cell, but also why it occurred, who was responsible for it, and what it reveals about an era in which political murder was both an art form and a statement. The simple narrative of an overthrown monarch meeting his end is not the truth concerning Edward II's death. Rather, the truth is more complicated and more horrible than one might think. It is a story that compels us to confront unsettling concerns regarding justice, sexuality, and the cost of ultimate power. Questions that continue to be uncomfortably pertinent even in the present day. We must first have an understanding of the man that Edward II was and the environment that influenced him in order to realize the atrocity that occurred during his final hours. Young Edward was born in 1284 because he was the 4th son of the formidable Edward I, often known as Longshanks. He spent his childhood in the shadow of one of the most successful military monarchs in England's history. It was his father who had built England as a powerful military power, as well as conquered Wales and dominated Scotland. Although it was anticipated that Edward would carry on this tradition of power and conquest, it became abundantly evident from the time he was a young child that he was not a typical member of the family. During the early 14th century, the situation in medieval England was a civilization that is constructed around rigid hierarchies and unyielding standards of royal behavior. It was expected of kings that they would first and foremost be warriors, leading their armies into combat and expanding their realms by conquest. These individuals were to be devout Christians, obedient husbands, and fathers who were capable of ensuring the succession of the royal family. Personal relationships, particularly those that could be construed as unsuitable or politically disadvantageous, were allowed to take a back seat to the requirements of the monarch and the kingdom. It was almost immediately after Edward's succession to the throne in 1307 that he began to have difficulties. Edward II appeared to be more engaged in his personal relationships and recreational pastimes than he was in the difficult business of kingship, in contrast to his father, who had won respect by military triumphs and good governance. His profound affinity with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston became the initial source of controversy. This was not simply due to the closeness of their relationship. Rather, it was due to the fact that Edward elevated Gaveston to positions of power, which infuriated other members of the established aristocracy. The existence of a delicate equilibrium between royal power and noble privilege was essential to the functioning of the political system in medieval England. The great barons anticipated that they would be consulted on affairs of state, that they would hold the most important offices, and that they would receive patronage from the royal family. This essential system was disrupted when Edward instead heaped titles, lands, and power upon Gaveston, a foreigner of relatively modest birth. Gaveston was a foreigner. The Earl of Cornwall, which is considered to be one of the most coveted titles in England, was bestowed upon Gaveston in addition to having large lands and the king's undeniable favor in all affairs. The inherent nature of the relationship between Edward and Gaveston was the factor that contributed to the combustible nature of this circumstance. According to medieval chroniclers, who wrote with varied degrees of enmity toward the king, they characterized their relationship in terms that were quite unsettling to people living during that time period. It was a violation of medieval expectations of how a king should conduct himself in an age when royal marriages were used as diplomatic tools and personal desires were expected to be subordinated to political necessity. Whether their relationship was romantic, as many historians now believe, or simply an unusually intense friendship, it was a violation of these expectations. Many people had the impression that Edward's clear loyalty to Gaveston was a dangerous weakness that posed a threat to the stability of the realm. As a result of Edward's military campaigns beginning to fail catastrophically, the crisis became even more severe. He was left with continuous hostilities in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was battling for Scottish independence. His father had left him with these problems. Edward was subjected to a string of humiliating defeats, which prevented him from achieving the lightning-fast triumphs that may have helped restore trust in his leadership. In 1314, the most damaging battle was the Battle of Bannockburn, in which a substantially smaller Scottish force defeated the English army. This victory resulted in the capture of a large number of nobles and dealt a blow to the prestige of the English military, from which Edward never recovered. Bannockburn was more than just a military disaster. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership that illustrated Edward's inherent shortcomings as a warrior monarch. Bannockburn was a battle that took place in Scotland. When it came to fighting throughout the Middle Ages, royal presence and inspiration were just as important as battle strategy and military numbers. If a king was unable to lead his troops to victory, if he appeared indecisive or weak in the face of the adversary, then not only did he lose battles, but he also lost the vital mystique that is associated with royal power. As time went on, Edward's nobility began to view him not as their divinely chosen king, but rather as a threat to England's prosperity and safety. The aftermath of the Battle of Bannockburn resulted in the formation of a well-organized, noble resistance to Edward's rule, which was led by his own cousin Thomas of Lancaster. The authority of the king was subjected to a series of progressively stringent limits that were imposed by a number of powerful barons. The right to approve royal appointments, oversee royal finances, and ultimately limit Edward to the role of the figurehead was what they requested during their campaign. It was not just conflicts over policy that led to this struggle. Rather, it was a question of whether or not Edward II was even qualified to rule at all. The marriage of the monarch to Isabella of France in the year 1308 made the situation much more unstable than it existed before. It was initially arranged as a diplomatic alliance with the intention of strengthening ties between England and France, and the marriage started off on a hopeful note. Isabella was a queen who was not only highly clever, but also stunningly attractive and politically savvy. She was the kind of queen who may have helped Edward's turbulent reign become more stable. In what appeared to be her major role as a royal wife, she gave birth to 4 children for him, one of which was Edward III, who would later follow in his footsteps. However, Isabella's position became increasingly difficult as Edward's connection with his favorites continued to dominate court life. Both of these factors contributed to the situation. Following Gaveston's final execution by hostile nobility in the year 1312, Edward developed similarly strong associations with other men, the most notable of which was with Hugh Despenser the Younger. As a result of their influence on the king, the Despensers, who were a father and son, were much more powerful and more despised than Gaveston had been. They effectively ruled England while amassing immense wealth and estates for themselves. As Isabella watched her husband disregard his royal duties and his marriage while lavishing love, emotion, and resources on his male favorites, she found it increasingly difficult to accept the consequences of his actions. She was not only a jealous wife. Rather, she was a queen whose political status and personal dignity were being methodically damaged by Edward's behavior. She was a queen. Edward's reign was seen as a dishonor to royal dignity and an insult to their daughter by the French court, where she had grown up. The French court observed the English situation with increasing anxiety and contempt. Isabella's refusal to return to England during a diplomatic mission to France in the middle of the 1320s was the pivotal moment that brought the situation to a breaking point. On the other hand, she started an open affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had his own reasons for wanting revenge against Edward II. Mortimer had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, but had escaped to France, where he and Isabella began planning what would become one of the most successful palace coups in the history of the world. Mortimer was the kind of powerful and resolute man that Isabella had hoped to find in her husband, and she found it in Mortimer. Their relationship was both personal and political during this time. Together, Mortimer and Isabella began the process of amassing an invasion force, garnering support from dissatisfied English nobility, and making preparations to remove Edward II by the use of force. Mortimer saw Isabella as the ideal vehicle for his return to power in England. From being a wife who was neglected to being the leader of a revolution against her own husband, the Queen had experienced a remarkable transformation. It was a rapid and destructive invasion that took place in 1326. A small force led by Isabella and Mortimer arrived in Suffolk, but practically immediately after their arrival, Edward's authority immediately fell apart. As a result of years of animosity against the Despensers and discontent with Edward's administration, very few people were eager to fight for the king. There was a steady stream of nobles who expressed their support for Isabella, and Edward found himself with almost little backing. After being apprehended, the Despensers were put to death in a very horrific manner. Although Hugh Despenser the Younger was ultimately executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering, he was not executed without first being subjected to additional tortures that showed the anger that his authority had caused. Edward escaped in the direction of the west, with the intention of reaching Wales or Ireland, where he may find safety. Nevertheless, he was apprehended close to the border with Wales in November of 1326. As a prisoner, the man who had once been one of the most powerful kings in Europe was now completely at the mercy of people whom he had alienated by years of misrule. Not only did his capture signal the end of his reign, but also marked the beginning of a well-coordinated operation to thoroughly destroy him, not only as a monarch, but also as a man. The removal of Edward II from his position was a first in the annals of English history. The act of formally removing a king from the throne while he was still alive had never been done before, and it required meticulous legal and political maneuvering in order to create even an appearance of legality. Isabella and Mortimer, who were now reigning in the name of Edward's baby son, who would later become Edward III, had to walk a fine line between appearing to behave legitimately and ensuring that Edward would never again pose a danger to their position. In January of 1327, Parliament was called to order, although it was not quite a free discussion, because Mortimer's followers were in charge of London and Edward was being held accountable for his actions. Nobles and clergy who had gathered together were faced with a difficult decision. Either they should legally remove Edward II, or they would have to face the repercussions of opposing the new administration. Incompetence, failure to defend the realm, enabling favorites to reign in his place, and bringing dishonor to the crown were the crushing charges that were brought against Edward, all of which were brought against him. The process was largely a show trial that was designed to offer legal cover for what was fundamentally a successful coup. Despite the fact that these claims had some truth, the process was nevertheless a show trial. Rather from only being a palace revolution, The deposition made the claim that it represented the will of the entire country. This was the most original component of the deposition. The insistence of Isabella and Mortimer was that they were acting on behalf of everyone of England, including the commons, the clergy, and the nobility, in order to remove an unfit king and replace him with someone who was capable of good rule. The precedents for parliamentary participation were established as a result of this revolutionary constitutional event, which would have long-lasting ramifications for the administration of English affairs. An involvement in royal succession that would reoccur in later centuries. Edward's formal abdication was accomplished by a combination of legal coercion and implicit threats. This was done in order to remove him from his position as king. Representatives were dispatched to Kenilworth Castle, the location where Charles was being kept, in order to inform him of the decision made by Parliament and to demand that he formally renounce his claim to the monarchy. Chroniclers described the sight as being pitiful in their recording of it. During the moment that he consented to hand over his crown to his son, the former king, who was now clad in plain black garb, shed tears. The question of whether or not this abdication was truly voluntary or whether it was extracted under duress is still a topic of historical controversy. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that Edward had little option under the circumstances. The newly formed administration was confronted with a core challenge. What should be done with the ousted monarch? It would be unthinkable to just release him because he would always be a potential rallying point for those who are opposed to the new leadership. It was both politically risky and financially costly to keep him locked up for an indeterminate period of time. In other kingdoms, there were precedents for dealing with inconvenient previous rulers. However, none of these examples quite mirrored the position that Edward was up against. The answer that they ultimately decided to go with was one that was both covert and ominous. The relocation of Edward from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire was apparently intended to address concerns over safety and financial concerns. Thomas de Berkeley, a baron whose family had endured hardships as a result of Edward's rule, was the owner of Berkeley. He was a reliable individual who understood the need of ensuring that the former king was safely confined. The selection of Berkeley was not a random occurrence. It was situated in a location that was far enough away to preclude any attempts at rescue, secure enough to prevent any escape, and governed by an individual who had personal reasons to despise Edward II. The conditions of Edward's confinement at Berkeley were created with the intention of being cruel. He was not provided with the luxuries that were fitting for someone of his royal blood. Rather, he was confined to a cell that was intended to destroy his spirit and undermine his health. As crucial as the physical limits were, the psychological warfare was also very important. In addition to being deprived of his freedom and crown, Edward was also going to have his dignity and hope taken away from him. Each and every facet of his day-to-day existence was meticulously planned to serve as a constant reminder of his fall from grace and his total reliance on the compassion of his mistress. Several historical reports assert that the conditions at Berkeley were intended to cause Edward's death to occur gradually, while also preserving the possibility of plausible deniability regarding the reason of his passing. The cell was reputedly situated above the sewers of the castle, which put him in danger of contracting diseases and breathing in bad air. Despite the fact that his treatment was intentionally humiliating, his food was poor and inconsistent, and his mattress was inadequate. It is possible for his captors to assert that they had just been keeping him as directed, without any purpose of causing his death, in the event that he passed away due to disease or despair. The methodical approach to Edward's elimination, on the other hand, appears to have met with resistance from those in positions of authority. During the summer of 1327, political pressures were increasing for a more permanent solution to the situation of the monarch who had been ousted. There were rumors going around about probable attempts to rescue the person, and judges from other countries started asking questions that were unpleasant. The manner in which Edward was treated Isabella and Mortimer required Edward to pass away, but they wanted his passing to be natural or, at the very least, not obviously the result of killing. An important turning point in this sad chapter of English history was the decision to go from passive to aggressive efforts against Edward's life. This decision marked a crucially important turning point. A story that is so gruesome and symbolic that many historians have questioned whether it could really be true is the one that would become one of the most contested and horrifying incidents in the medieval chronicles. What happened next at Berkeley Castle would become one of the most horrifying episodes. Nevertheless, the evidence implies that something very horrific took place in that castle cell, something that represented not only the desire to destroy a political adversary, but also the desire to send a message about the repercussions of violating the ideals of royal behavior that were prevalent during the medieval period. The summer of 1327 marked an increase in the amount of pressure that was placed on Isabella and Mortimer to find a lasting solution to the dilemma of Edward II. Courts in other countries, particularly those in France and the Holy Roman Empire, started to pose serious questions regarding the treatment of the former monarch. There were continuous rumors that there were conspiracies to liberate Edward from Berkeley Castle, and Pope John V had voiced concern about Edward's well-being. Reports that some English nobility were having second thoughts about the deposition, questioning whether they had gone too far in removing an anointed king from his throne, were even more disturbing than the deposition itself. Edward II, if he were still alive, would always be a threat to the new regime, according to the political arithmetic, which was ruthless but unambiguous. Despite the fact that he had formally abdicated his position as king, many people continued to view him as the rightful ruler for as long as he lived. The fact that his son, Edward III, was still a minor meant that Isabella and Mortimer's power was wholly dependent on their capacity to resist any restoration of the monarch who had been overthrown. The fact that they had crossed a line rendered it hard for them to reconcile. They were obligated to proceed with their coup until it reached its natural end, regardless of how gloomy the conclusion might be. Deniability and symbolism were both elements that were present in the solution that was developed, which was typical of political murders that occurred during the Middle Ages. A death like this would make a martyr out of Edward, and may potentially incite revolt among those who still felt devotion to the legitimate royal line. It is not possible for Edward to be stabbed or poisoned in a manner that is visible. Instead, it was necessary for his death to have a natural appearance, while simultaneously acting as a cautionary tale to others about the penalties that would be imposed for defying the new order. Conflicting versions of what actually took place at Berkeley Castle in September 1327 are provided by contemporary chroniclers who wrote their accounts years or even decades after the events that took place when they were written. There are many who simply assert that Edward passed away due to natural causes, suffering from grief and being treated poorly. Some individuals make oblique references to more ominous events without providing specifics. However, the most comprehensive and unsettling accounts depict a death that was so horrifying and rich with symbolism that it appears to have been meant not only to end Edward's life, but also to damage his reputation and terrify his potential followers. It is the version of Edward's that has received the most attention. There existed a technique of execution that was both brutally effective and profoundly symbolic, and it was used to have Edward put to death. According to these reports, the former king was restrained by his guards while a rod made of red-hot iron was forced into his body through his rectum. This caused his internal organs to be burned, resulting in a painful death that did not leave any visible signs of violence on the outside. By using this strategy, his murderers would be able to claim that he had passed away due to natural causes, while at the same time making sure that his death was as excruciating and humiliating as it could possibly be. It is impossible to ignore the symbolic significance of the claimed method of delivery of the sentence. The punishments that were handed out in medieval times were frequently tailored to reflect the type of the crime that had been committed, and Edward's suspected homosexual relationships with his favorite people had caused his contemporaries to be scandalized. According to the tales, his death was designed as the ultimate demonstration of scorn for what his adversaries perceived to be his sexual sins and his failure to represent true masculine royal power. If the accounts are genuine, then his death was crafted on purpose. Because of the practical implications of carrying out such an operation, significant planning and the participation of a number of different people would have been required. To achieve the desired result, while leaving as little evidence as possible. The iron would need to be heated to the appropriate temperature. The victim would need to be confined in an efficient manner, and the act would need to be carried out with adequate expertise. This was not a crime of passion or a choice made on the spur of the moment. Rather, it would have been a premeditated act of political terrorism with the intention of sending a message about the repercussions of crossing Isabella and Mortimer. The announcement that Edward had passed away on September 21st, 1327, was made to the newly formed administration in London with a promptness that might be considered dubious. It was determined that the official cause of death was natural death due to grief and illness, and extensive funeral arrangements were prepared as fast as possible to display the new regime's regard for the dignity of the royal family. Edward's body was apparently exposed in public before he was buried, and it did not appear to have any visible evidence of violence, which would be compatible with the way that is being said to have been used to kill him. The manner in which individuals responded to the news of Edward's passing was highly variable, depending on their political stance. The expressions of mourning that Isabella and Mortimer displayed were appropriate, but they also quietly celebrated the elimination of their biggest threat. Those who supported the previous administration discussed murder in hushed tones, but refrained from speaking out loud. The common people, who had endured the misrule of Edward but yet maintained some respect for royal authority, were perplexed and frightened by the quick sequence of events that had resulted in their monarch being ousted, imprisoned, and ultimately killed in a span of less than a year. The brutality of the claimed method of Edward's murder is not the only thing that makes the account of his death particularly unsettling. The cold calculation that it depicts is also a significant factor. This was not a crime that was committed in a fit of rage or out of desperation. Rather, it was political murder that was brought to the level of performance art with the intention of breaking down not only a man, but also the whole concept of a man. Not only was the actual result significant, but the symbolism was also significant since it served as a warning to anyone who may resist the new order about what they could anticipate. Following the immediate aftermath of Edward II's death, it became clear that this final act of his tragedy had been meticulously planned out. In a few hours after the revelation was made, couriers were sent out over England to deliver the news to various authorities, including sheriffs, lords, and church officials. The rapidity and synchronization of this communication gave the impression that the death had been predicted and arranged for, as opposed to being a sudden natural occurrence, as the official stories portrayed it to be. The actual Berkeley Castle changed into a crime scene that was meticulously controlled. Almost immediately, Thomas de Berkeley, the owner of the castle, disassociated himself from any blame for Edward's death. He asserted that he had been absent from the castle at the key moment in time. A plausible deniability was provided to Berkeley by this convenient absence, which also ensured that someone with adequate authority was available to supervise Edward's final moments. This absence was almost certainly planned in advance. All of the other people who were present at the castle, including the guards, the servants, and the officials, were either pledged to maintaining confidentiality or eliminated as potential witnesses. The preparing of Edward's body for public exhibition was another essential component of the cover-up that was carried out. Despite the fact that the procedures used for embalming in the Middle Ages were somewhat crude, they were enough for preserving a corpse for the several weeks that were required to plan a royal funeral. To add insult to injury, the process of embalming would obliterate a significant portion of the internal evidence of the claimed torture, making it extremely difficult for anybody to question the official cause of death through the inspection of the remains. It was a masterpiece of political theater, aiming to demonstrate Isabella and Mortimer's real mourning while also bolstering their authority as custodians of royal honor. The burial itself was a masterpiece. The body of Edward was transported from Berkeley to Gloucester Cathedral with the necessary ceremony, attracting large numbers of witnesses who were able to see for themselves that the former king did not exhibit any visible symptoms of violence. It was declared that he was a legitimate monarch who had died naturally, and not as a victim of murder, in the ornate mausoleum that was constructed for him and which is still functioning today. The treatment of individuals who were most directly engaged in Edward's last imprisonment was perhaps the most striking aspect of the situation. Several of the guards and officials at Berkeley Castle met mysterious ends themselves within a few months of his passing. Some of them died in accidents, others vanished completely, and still others were discovered dead under circumstances that suggested they knew too much about what had actually occurred within the castle. The elimination of witnesses in a methodical manner is the final part of the cover-up, which ensured that the truth about Edward's killing was lost along with those who had observed it. It turned out that Isabella and Mortimer had planned for the broader political ramifications of Edward's murder to materialize exactly as they had anticipated. The opposition to the new rule was eradicated completely after the former king was removed from power permanently. Although the young Edward III was crowned with the necessary ceremonial, the real authority continued to be held firmly in the hands of his mother and her boyfriend for a number of years. It was appropriate that Edward was murdered in such a horrible manner because the removal of an inept king and the establishment of what appeared to be a more effective government were both successful. Nevertheless, the very violence that made Edward's death politically effective also held the seeds of Isabella and Mortimer's eventual collapse. As a result, the murder was a political success. The stories that were passed down from generation to generation about what had actually occurred at Berkeley Castle generated an undertone of revulsion and terror, which progressively eroded their authority. Many individuals who had previously advocated for the removal of Edward II from his position started to wonder if they had unleashed forces that were too dark and dangerous to be controlled. Both the moral authority of the new regime and the line that separated necessary political action from unspeakable cruelty had been crossed, and the new leadership's moral authority was irreversibly undermined. For a number of reasons, including the fact that the majority of foreign courts were pleased to see England's political dilemma handled, and the fact that the official tale of natural death was difficult to contest without actual evidence. The international reaction to Edward's death was more subdued than one might have anticipated. Private correspondence between royal courts, on the other hand, displays a significant amount of skepticism regarding the actual events surrounding Edward's death. This mistrust had an impact on England's diplomatic connections for many years to come. Particularly crucial is the fact that the young Edward III learned valuable lessons from his father's fate, which would later influence his own attitude to the role of king. As he got older and started to impose his own authority, he did not exhibit any of his father's tendency toward weakness or hesitation. In 1330, he eventually overthrew Isabella and Mortimer in a rapid and decisive manner, which suggests that he had learnt from both the errors of his father and the techniques that were employed to remove him. In the end, the violence that had led to the death of Edward II was responsible for creating the conditions for its own punishment. In the course of several centuries, historians have been captivated by the subject of whether or not Edward II was indeed murdered in the gruesome manner that was portrayed by certain chroniclers. In light of the fact that the data is both inconsistent and politically driven, it is impossible to draw solid conclusions. What we are able to state with absolute certainty is that influential individuals desired Edward's death, that he passed away under mysterious circumstances while he was in their possession, and that the official explanations were crafted with the intention of protecting the murderers rather than revealing the complete truth. The entire myth of Edward's horrible murder, according to the arguments of some contemporary historians, was a later fiction that was aimed to tarnish the reputations of Isabella and Mortimer after they had already had their own collapse. The awful details were created later by chroniclers who wished to underline the depravity of the usurpers. This idea suggests that Edward may have died naturally or been executed in a more conventional manner. The horrific details were added later. It appears that the symbolic aspect of the purported method of death, which was so neatly structured to mirror medieval ideas about Edward's supposed sexual misdeeds, is almost too clean to be historical truth. Nevertheless, there are additional pieces of evidence that lend credence to the more sinister interpretation of the events: the methodical removal of witnesses, the meticulous administration of Edward's There is a strong indication that something more nefarious than a natural death took place at Berkeley Castle, as evidenced by the death scene, as well as the political benefits that his murder offered to Isabella and Mortimer. The reports are more credible due to the fact that similar methods of execution were utilized in other political killings that occurred during the medieval period. This is true even if the precise details may have been inflated over the course of time. And reason that could be considered the most convincing in support of the murder scenario is the political logic that underlies the circumstance. After making a decision, Isabella and Mortimer had committed themselves to a course of action that would make it impossible for Edward to continue existing. They had removed an anointed monarch from authority, taken control in the name of his son, who was still a minor, and purged Edward's followers by means of execution and removal from the country. Under these conditions, allowing Edward to continue living would have been not only fraught with political peril, but also a suicide attempt. They were unable to go back because they had already traveled too far. The claimed method that was used to kill Edward displays a level of psychological expertise that relates to the medieval sense of power, humiliation, and symbolic justice. If this approach is accurate, then it provides evidence of this level of intelligence. This was not merely a murder. Rather, it was a statement that had been meticulously designed about the repercussions of breaching the rules associated with society. Edward's execution was intended to reflect and punish those crimes in the most severe way imaginable. His reported homosexual associations had caused his contemporaries to be scandalized, and his death was aimed to reflect and punish those transgressions. The fact that this instance blends the desire for personal vengeance with the need to fulfill governmental obligations is what makes it particularly unsettling. She had been personally humiliated by Edward's neglect and his clear preference for male favorites over his wife and queen. Isabella's objectives were not solely political. She had been humiliated both personally and professionally. The manner in which he is said to have been put to death hints to a degree of personal vengeance that goes beyond simple political calculation. It is a reflection of the wrath of a woman who had been relentlessly humiliated and ignored by the man who was supposed to honor and protect her. In addition to the immediate political repercussions of the year 1327, the legacy of Edward II's death reaches far beyond those limits. The event, regardless of whether it was based on reality or tradition, became ingrained in English folklore and political consciousness. It served as a cautionary tale about the perils of weak kingship and the repercussions of breaching societal standards. It established precedents for the deposition of kings that would resurface during later constitutional crises, particularly during the English Civil War and the eventual execution of Charles I. The case also reveals the medieval relationship between sexuality, power, and political legitimacy in ways that remain uncomfortable and relevant today. Edward's demise was not about his inadequacies as a military leader or administrator alone. Rather, it was about his perceived failure to represent legitimate masculine authority and his apparent penchant for relationships that violated modern societal ideals. Both of these factors contributed to Edward's downfall. The purpose of his death, whether it was real or imagined, was to punish not only inappropriate sexual behavior, but also political failure. The narrative of Edward II's demise is one that many contemporary audiences find to be fraught with challenging questions. Our comprehension of the past is complicated by the nature of historical reality, as well as the ways in which political propaganda can influence our perceptions of the past. It's possible that the reports of Edward II's violent death are historical records of a horrifying crime, or they could be later forgeries created to explain the conduct of his son, Edward III, and to tarnish the reputations of Isabella and Mortimer. In the labyrinth of medieval politics and propaganda, it is possible that the truth will be lost for all time. In an era in which power was personal, absolute, and unforgiving, the fate of Edward II stands as a sharp warning of the penalties of political failure. This is something that is still unmistakable. His death marked the end of one of the most terrible reigns in English history and inaugurated a new chapter in the long conflict between royal authority and noble resistance. Whether he died naturally was slain conventionally, or experienced the brutal end portrayed by the chroniclers. His death marked the end of one of the most catastrophic reigns in English history. The shadow that Edward II's death created went far beyond his own lifetime, and it continued to have an impact on the politics of England and the behavior of the royal family for many centuries to come. The sheer idea that a monarch might be not only removed from power, but also killed in such a gruesome and symbolic manner brought about a fundamental shift in the relationship that existed between those who ruled and those who were ruled. It was no longer possible for monarchs to presume that their divine appointment shielded them from the ultimate consequences of political failure. The precedent had been established that even anointed monarchs may be put to death if they alienated their subjects to a sufficient degree with their actions. Having acquired the crown as a result of his father's deposition and death, Edward III was able to acquire a strong understanding of these principles. His reign was defined by victories in France and Scotland that restored English reputation and proved the kind of warrior leadership that his father had so blatantly failed to offer. Furthermore, his reign became one of military glory and administrative competence. Edward III's achievement, whether deliberately or unconsciously, marked a systematic repudiation of all that his father had stood for. It demonstrated that the Plantagenet line could produce competent rulers if they were guided by the hard lessons that Edward II's failure had taught them. The constitutional precedents that were created as a result of the political changes that accompanied Edward II's deposition, in particular the participation of Parliament in the process of removing a monarch and the assertion that such actions might represent the desire of the entire kingdom, would reverberate throughout the history of England. The notion that kingship was contingent upon successful rule rather than having an absolute divine right gained root in the political awareness of the English people, and it would eventually lead to the establishment of constitutional monarchy, which would take place centuries later. Despite the fact that Isabella was initially successful in ousting Edward II, she ultimately paid a significant price for her role in the subsequent death of Edward II. One of the first things that Edward III did after he came of age and asserted his own authority was to capture and execute Roger Mortimer. At the same time, he confined his mother to a comfortable but permanent retirement from politics. According to the formal charges brought against Mortimer, he was responsible for the death of Edward II, which suggests that even the new king was under the impression that his father had been murdered rather than going through a natural death. Additionally significant were the repercussions that Edward's death had on a global scale. Other European courts took note of how swiftly and totally an established king could collapse when he lost the backing of his nobles and his people. This was a phenomenon that was seen extensively. The savage efficiency with which Edward was eliminated provided as both an inspiration and a warning to other rulers who were experiencing rebellion from within their own country. This served to demonstrate that in the medieval era, political failure could have the most harsh personal consequences. The account of Edward II's death became ingrained in the cultural memory of England as a cautionary tale about the perils of ineffective leadership and unsuitable personal connections. This is perhaps the most essential aspect of the story. The gruesome details of his alleged murder played a powerful symbolic role, reinforcing social norms about masculine authority, royal duty, and the repercussions of breaching established expectations. This was true regardless of whether or not the facts were accurate. Over the course of several centuries, attitudes on leadership and power were shaped by the narrative, which eventually became ingrained in the collective unconscious of English political culture. Although Edward's death itself has proven to be politically advantageous, the mystery that surrounds the specific circumstances surrounding his passing has also proven to be useful. An example of a historical Rorschach test that reveals as much about those who tell the narrative as it does about the events themselves is Edward II's fate. This is because the uncertainty allows each generation to interpret the story according to their own values and political demands. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages used it to justify the actions of Edward III, and writers of the Reformation used it to attack the intervention of the Pope in English affairs. As a matter of evidence and interpretation, It is a topic of discussion among contemporary historians. It is indisputable that the passing of Edward II signified the conclusion of one of the most tragic and illuminating reigns in the annals of English history. The events that transpired throughout his life serve as a reminder that in the medieval world, failures on both the personal and political fronts might have ramifications that were beyond comprehension. In a time when power was personal, absolute, and completely unforgiving, his death symbolizes the ultimate price of political inadequacy. Whether he died naturally, was murdered in the traditional manner, or endured the awful fate reported by modern chroniclers, his death represents the ultimate price of political inadequacy. It's possible that the final lesson that may be learned from Edward II passing is that the stories we tell about historical events are more important than the truth about those events. The reports of his violent murder, regardless of whether they were based on facts or were made up, had significant political and social functions for the individuals who recounted them. They gave legitimacy for the conduct of those who followed after them, reaffirmed social norms regarding suitable royal behavior, and warned of the dangers that would result from weak kingship. In this sense, the tale of Edward's death became more potent than the death itself, and it shaped the political culture of England in ways that reached well beyond the confines of Berkeley Castle and the brief life of one king who was unsuccessful. At this very moment, over 7 centuries after that night in September, we continue to struggle with the questions that are brought up by the destiny of Edward II. How far may political opposition go without being considered a threat? When it comes to resistance to power, where are the appropriate limits? When does a change that is essential become an act of unjustifiable brutality? These questions are just as pertinent today as they were in medieval England, which ensures that the tragic tale of Edward II's demise will continue to connect with audiences in the current era. In addition to being a lesson in history, it is also a timeless warning about the nature of power, the ways in which it can be used, and the horrible repercussions that can result when they are misused.